there are some worked examples. There's nothing too sensitive, but this should be treated as a refresher and very conceptual in nature. I see that there are some UAS project people in attendance. I'm not going to go into UAS stuff in specific detail. I'm focusing mainly on the aircraft. However, if you have questions about how any of this stuff relates to UAS, it's all related. It's all related. So especially with the high-end UAS, it's just more about the extent to which you do all the same stuff for an aircraft. So yeah, feel free to ask questions. If I can't answer on the spot, I'll take it on notice and we'll see what we can do about getting back to you. Righto, so broadly, this is what I'm going to run through this afternoon. I hope everybody can see the slides. Can somebody give me a nod so you can see the slides? Cool, thanks Namzi. Thanks. Righto, so as I say, ADF specific and a refresher. All right, so we're going to talk through about how we generally buy aircraft, the environment that we buy into from a technical nature, and then how we go about building a type based around these situations that we find ourselves in. All right, so every good topic starts with a definition. Okay, so as you've read here on the slide, is what certification is. So there's a few acronyms there. So under the DASR, this certification process has a pretty clear start and a very clear finish. Right? It starts with your certification program plan, which we'll talk about a little later, and that's a contractual-like agreement between an applicant, someone who's applying for a type, and the regulator, who agrees that if all these activities are met to a satisfactory standard, they agree that they will issue a type. Right, so part of that plan, there's some initial detail, including a type certification basis and a certification checklist. So that's TCB and CCL. So those are essentially, you see those thrown around a lot interchangeably. They are the same kind of thing. The TCB is a paragraph or two, like a wordy definition on what that benchmark is. So CCL is a very long, very detailed checklist of everything that is part of that benchmark. All right. And the end of this process is a declaration of compliance. So once the applicant is confident that he or she has completed everything that they have to, that was agreed up front in the plan, they declare compliance, they declare that they're complete, submit a Form 31 for a new type, or a Form 31A in the case of modification, and their instrument is hopefully issued at that point. So what certification is not? All right, there's a list of things here. I won't read them all. I'll just give you a minute. All right, so we're going to talk about some of the differences between the technical airworthiness regulations and the DASR later on. But one of the key differences is that under your design acceptance, under the technical airworthiness regulations, they're part of that declaration at the end there, you had to declare that your modification or your system was fit for purpose. Now, under the DASR, that's no longer necessarily the case. If you declared your airworthiness benchmark up front, you meet your airworthiness benchmark. If it's not fit for purpose and never incorporated onto the type, it's not really considered as part of that DASR process. Okay, and as I said in the bottom line here, it's not verification and validation. Although practically aircraft manufacturers frequently link the two together, because both your V&V program and your certification program require a large body of evidence. Sometimes those are generated in the same way at the same time. Right, so they are often linked, and there are overlaps between the two programs in time, in schedule, in their execution, but obviously they're not the same thing. Okay, next slide, WHS. So our current set of airworthiness regulations, being the DASR, is based on the European Military Aviation Regulation, which is based on the EASA regulations. Now, importantly, if you have a look at that, the DASR, it's set out that it has the basic regulation, which is the BR there, and implementing regulations. So the implementing regulations are how you implement the basic regulations. The basic regulations are almost a goal-like set of functions that you are required to have as an airworthiness regulator. Right now, the reason they're split up like that, under EASA, the basic regulation is EU law. Right, so they're enshrined in law. EASA then issues the implementing regulations to say, hey, countries establishing an airworthiness regulator, here's a suggested way to go about it. You have these things in law, these obligations that you have that you must complete, you must establish this framework. Here's a good way to do it with these implementing regulations. So obviously the legal situation is a bit different for us in that we have the WHS Act being Commonwealth law, and the ADF has selected the EMAR as a basis on which to build a regulation set, which is our means of compliance with that WHS Act. Right, so we're introducing here a little bit on what has changed between the TA regs and the DASR. The certification process itself is more or less the same. The airworthiness codes that the ADF recognise is more or less the same. But there are some changes here that will affect you when you're executing a program. Right, so the Part 21J, I'm sure most of you are familiar with that term. It's the military design organisation. It has rules for that military design organisation. Now that's similar in some ways to the old AEO that used to perform engineering under the TA regs, but really not the same. there's a whole lot of stuff in that 21J that is not that engineering organization. So there are some similarities. There are parts of that 21J instruction set that you'll read through and go, hey, that looks familiar. Or however, there are some other concepts that are introduced there that are nothing like what we had before. Now, so the 21J does introduce this term, the applicant, and the applicant is the individual empowered to apply for a type or for the modification of a type or a supplemental type. Now, that's again, some of that role is similar to the old design acceptance representative. Some of it's similar to the old senior design engineer, but there are a lot of differences. For instance, they don't have to be part of an MDOA. Right? So they don't have to be part of a design organization. All of the compliance demonstration evidence that they use to demonstrate compliance with the CCL has to come out of one of those organizations, a DOA or an MDOA. However, the applicant doesn't have to be part of that themselves. All right, so some of the key differences I've noted there in those last 2 points. The establishing a TCB or a CCL or a CBD, it used to be called, establishing that for a change, there is now a prescribed way to do it, or it used to be reasonably free form. There is a prescribed way to do it. There's a book called the EMAC. There's the EMAC guidebook that goes with the EMAC handbook. It's a good read. It's about, say, 20 pages or so, and explains how to use it, why to use it, how to step through for a given design and select an appropriate set of, so let's say an appropriate benchmark out of your relevant airworthiness code. Now, one of the key things there is that once you establish your TCB for a type, every modification to that type is a deliberate change of that CCL. So that's always your starting point. So previously, if we had, say, a FAR25 based type initially that we recognised, forget the old terminology, the informed recognition of prior acceptance. I'd say if we were using that recognition of prior acceptance on a FAR25 based platform, any modifications that we did to that platform, there was nothing to stop us selecting a completely different airworthiness code for the scope of that modification. So now there is. It's a deliberate, that type that was established up front, the CCL associated with that type is now a living document. So you're consciously changing that document throughout the life of the type of the platform. And so that's a big change. The person who holds that CCL is the type holder. And that brings me to the bottom point here. So that's another one of those key concepts that's been brought in by the DASA, the concept of a type holder who deliberately modifies that type. And there are rules around how they do that. Okay, so the concept of type ownership here, I've just mentioned that. I'll give you a second to go through the slide. Okay, so we've already talked about most of this. I'm hoping that this type ownership concept isn't new to everybody. If it is, there's some recommended reading down the bottom. I'd suggest it's a smart thing for you to note down and go and chase down. It'll only take 10 minutes. Okay, so in the ADF, we buy aircraft a number of ways. So I'm going to list out sort of 3 key ways here, with the lens of building a type from buying those aircraft. So from this, as you see, the picture here is a classic example of a military-only aircraft. It's never going to be anything else. So if we buy an aircraft from a foreign military or the military off the shelf, right, we generally buy from people that we trust. We generally buy from people who have their own robust airworthiness frameworks in place, and we leverage heavily off the work that they do. Okay, now in most of those cases, the configuration of the aircraft that this foreign military, our foreign partner, certifies, and the aircraft that we buy is usually very, very similar. Right, so if anything that we're dealing with, they're mostly, we use them a little differently, or we subject them to a little different environment. Sometimes harsher, sometimes not so harsh. As in, we've bought Hornets and don't do carrier landings, right? But we've bought 737 based platforms and other things that, say P3 Orions, that we subject to very, very harsh environments. Right, and they weren't necessarily ever designed for that. However, for these military things, mostly it's the config that stays the same, and it's the other things that change. So it's reasonably straightforward. We've done a bunch of this. We know this stuff fairly well. We've got some good partners that we cooperate with. They're usually reasonably straightforward programs. Civil derivatives. More and more we've been doing this. So we've take a well-known design that's flying around carrying passengers, and we change it to suit our purposes. So in that particular case of the tanker that's presented there, we've changed the configuration of that a fair bit. Now, most of these have, I'll say, firewalled sections of functionality, where we try and keep the original aircraft separate to the predominantly mission systems that we put into them. However, I will talk about it later, but introducing systems and modifying systems can also affect aircraft level functions, right? And some of those are the key problems that we have with this type of acquisition, right? And as I say, I'll talk about that later. We'll go into an example on this because it's important. And it's easy to overlook when you think about this at a conceptual level. Right, and number 3, we buy aircraft where there are related civil types. Right, so, and as you can see the two there, there's an LM100J down the bottom there. The civilian type is 382J. We've got C130Js. So those, the structure, the engines, a lot of those things, to look at it from the outside, looks very much the same. On the inside, a lot of the systems that are performing, say the key navigate, communicate functions, a lot of those systems are different. Right, so there are large bodies of effort that we can reuse, that we can borrow from those civilian variants, but really got to be careful about what they have and haven't changed between those two types. So there's cases there again where we can bring ourselves undone quite easily, depending on assumptions that that may have been made in the civilian type versus the military type, depending on certain equipment that's enabled or disabled in each variant. All right. Yeah, I'm going to talk more about that later again. Okay, so planning your program. I'll give you 30 seconds to digest that diagram and then we'll talk through it. All right, so this is a visual representation of what will be described in your CPP, your certification program plan. You have multiple sources of evidence, most likely. Each of those sources of evidence that you're not generating for this specific program have to be contextualized through a configuration, role, and environment assessment against each of those instruments. We'll make findings. We'll assemble arguments, or however you want to put that. Out of those findings, there will be elements that get recorded directly in the CCL. There will be shortfalls, which we then have to work out how we're going to deal with it. And there's a number of ways that we can deal with that, where we could go back and generate some evidence to make up that shortfall. We could raise an MCRE to either change the benchmark or to accept a different way of demonstrating compliance. Or we can then assess that risk and put some treatments in place, which can involve modifications, which we would then need to generate evidence for. It could involve warnings in publications and training, and some of those also are going to drive modifications to the type. All right, after we've gone through that process, right, however we choose to solve the problem, that gets recorded in the CCL. The MCRE, the airworthiness issue paper, if there's an airworthiness issue paper, all of that gets recorded in the CCL. Remember, that CCL is now a living document. So all that stuff that we establish up front goes in there and stays in there until we consciously modify the aircraft to get rid of it, or we work out some other way to retire any risk associated with that, or change the conditions associated with that MCRE. If that doesn't make sense now, I'll talk about it more later. But yeah, so just know that that exists. So that's a key change to this certification process because of the introduction of the type holder. Now, our SOIU that's associated with that CCL, either of those can change over time, which could invoke us to go back and regenerate evidence. Right, those two documents are a pigeon pair. All right. Now, there's a lot of words on this slide. So if we stick to the main headings, a CPP, right? A CPP has to have 5 main sections, and I've laid out the 5 main sections here. It's not a story, right? If we pick up the document and read it like a book, there are things that are repeated. There are things that don't necessarily make sense. There are things that require extra information to contextualize it, right? So all of these things are going to be different, sometimes remarkably different with different programs. So the template that DASA has put out and refined over the first couple of years of operation under the DASA essentially boils down to these 5 seconds. So these 5 sections. I'll give you 30 seconds. Okay, so underneath each of these 5 sections, I've put a little dot point there to say, if I'm an independent person reading this section, what am I expecting to get out of it? This is from the point of view of somebody else who wants to understand the program. All right, so the very first section is setting up the context. All right, so that's straightforward. We'll move straight on. So second section, the description. So what is this certification program? What are we trying to certify? What are the changes? What are the details of those changes? What are the components? What pedigree do these components have? Are we using all, say, TSO certified electronics boxes? Are we fitting a brand new engine that is already a certified engine? Right. So are we dealing with a large body of unknown stuff, or do we have components of pedigree that we are integrating? All right. So this section has to lay out all of that. Right, next is our benchmark. So remember I mentioned earlier that the TCB, type certification basis, and the CCL, the certification checklist, are essentially the same information at different levels. So the TCB is the conceptual wordy description. The CCL is the details in a couple of 100-line spreadsheet, for example. All right, so section 3 is your wordy description, that TCB. It will be a primary certification code plus whatever supplementation. All right, now, the EADRM, it still recommends a bunch of primary certification codes that DASA already recognizes. You can propose something else, and along with some argument as to why it's okay to do that. But they've done some of the work for you, and if your certification program can use one of those, it's much easier. But then how are you going to supplement it? Do you already have MCREs against your type that you're modifying for some of these certification areas? If you do, those MCREs need to be listed in here, because that's your starting point. If you are a brand new aircraft and you are let's say from type 2, from earlier, you're a wedge tail, you're a P8, you're based on a civil aircraft that we're modifying to put some extra mission systems in, you're going to want some supplementation. Those mission systems, the civil airworthiness code that the green aircraft was built to aren't necessarily going to be applicable to those mission systems. Right, so there will be some appropriate standards, more than likely, that some other military or some other company has developed out there that will help us define how good is good enough. So all that stuff goes in here. So then section 4, how are you compiling an argument? So you've already said, you've said what you've got, you've said what your safety benchmark is. How are you going to generate evidence or acquire evidence that will demonstrate that your design, your aircraft, your modification, whatever it is, complies with that benchmark that you've set in section 3. All right, so again, if you are using, say, DASA 21J, MDOA organizations to generate all of this evidence for you, that should be fairly easy. All right. If you are using third parties, if you are using other airworthiness authorities, if you are using the US Navy, right, there are recognition certificates on the DASA website for a large number of both military and civilian organizations that DASA recognizes, and the degree to which we can recognize their work, right? Be careful when reading through those things. There are some caveats in there that are not abundantly clear exactly what they mean. So if you are, if you intend to use recognition to compile some evidence for your change, go and grab those certificates, engage with your DASA desktop person, your point of contact there. Ask them about it, dig into it, have a look at the caveats, have a look at what are the conditions for using those things, because those recognition certificates spell those details out a lot better than we ever had under TA regs. Okay, section 5, level of involvement. How much does DASA want to look at? And there are a number of factors that level of involvement is based on, but how much confidence do we have in the data sources? How much do we care about the things we're changing? If they're all mission systems, yeah, maybe the level of involvement goes down. If it's a trusted person, so a trusted airworthiness authority that is doing some stuff that lines up perfectly with our CRE, maybe the level of involvement goes down. All right, if we are having some company build a brand new product for us that's never existed before and uses some wild new technology to get some stuff done, level of involvement goes up. All right, so there's DASA internally have a matrix for how they kind of work that stuff out, and they'll tell you the points at which they want to get involved, the things they want to see along the way, testing they want to witness, all that kind of stuff. All that is agreed up front as much as possible. Things change as you go through your execution, but as much as possible, that stuff's agreed up front. And your CCL and any CREAs, that you have associated with this program, all get attached to the back of this document here. Now, hopefully everyone's seen one of these before. If not, there are a few decent ones bouncing around on different projects. If you can use your network to grab hold of one, I recommend you do that and have a quick read. Now, if we come back to our process here, now we've written a CPP to describe this entire process. We've said how we're going to execute our whole program, what our benchmark is, where we're getting our evidence from. So let's talk specifically about CRE analysis really quickly. All right, I'll give you 30 seconds to read the slide. All right, fairly straightforward. I'm sure everybody's seen these before and previous variations, so I'm not going to go into it in any level of detail. The long and the short is you need a CRE analysis for every evidence source that isn't being directly developed for your program. Every other type that you're using, or every related type that you're using, where you are claiming relief from developing compliance demonstration evidence, you need a CRE analysis to describe the extent to which that evidence is relevant to your type. So, previously established types. So, again, that right at the top there, recognition is claiming relief from developing compliance demonstration evidence. It's not, we're not talking about giving ourselves an out. The way the regulation is written, we would design what we would need to do, what a set of evidence we think we would need at a conceptual level, and then work out how much of that evidence already exists, or how much like evidence already exists. So this is pretty important, because when we're going through a project, it doesn't often work that way. We pretty much are identifying our previous types up front and saying, we reckon we can execute this project within CAS-G because we've got an aircraft that's got this and this and this, or because we're partnering with the USN on this program, or because this thing is already in service with the UK. All right, so as we're going through the project schedule, we've pretty much hitched our wagon up front to some of these previous types, and most of the time that works out reasonably well, albeit with some supplementation and some risk acceptance. But the regulations don't work that way. So the regulations are designed for your program to be specified up front, then your sources of evidence identified and contextualized. So all those sources of evidence are allowing you to claim relief from developing compliance demonstration evidence. So the wording's directly out of the regulations. All right, so most of the rest of that we've already talked about. So an example I just wanted to bring up here on the C27J. So it's one of the things that can bring us unstuck with using similar previously established types. That has, well, there is a civilian type that is similar to the military C27J. I say similar because there is a, how can I put this delicately? The glossy brochure would say it's the same. Now, the base configuration of the RAF C27J and the A.407 type established through EASA, the base configuration is the same. However, similar to the DASA has MCREs, EASA has CREs. They're the same thing, the certification review item. Now, there is a certification review item called Equipment Performing Military Functions, that EPMF, that is against that EASA type. And there are a whole list of equipment that is part of that configuration that can perform military functions that are disabled or otherwise impeded or tolerated as part of that civilian type. So once you dig into those details, systems and functions at the aircraft level that you would otherwise think, oh yes, they're part of that type, yes, it's in that configuration, and not necessarily part of the type. For example, there is a, say, military-only communications, military-only functions such as steep descent, such as airdrop. Now, there's nothing stopping you from opening the ramp in flight. However, key assumption of that civilian type is that you don't. So that's a gap in your certification. The steep descent functions and tactical flying and things like that, they can invoke further equipment qualification requirements. Those roles and some of that equipment are disabled as part of that civilian type. Right, so identifying how much you can claim credit for. Right, it's not necessarily always that straightforward. Right, some of this can be really difficult, and then working out what the gap is and what to do about the gap is well, it's why we have engineers, right? Okay, so something I've alluded to before, I just want to bring out a bit further. Systems versus functions. Now, a lot of airworthiness codes in the past made rules about systems, assuming a particular implementation of some of these systems. And more, certainly the FARs and the JARs from the FAA and the EASA publications, more and more they're moving towards functions over systems. They've specified an aircraft level function and put the onus on the aircraft designer to design a safe means of providing that function. All right, now I've put two examples here. So both of these, and that 251322, that flight crew alerts. So that even used to be called something different, like it was like aircrew warnings or something like that. And it used to specify different colored lights for different situations, and then list the set of situations that would correspond to a red light, right? So now that regulation lists an outcome. There must be an alerting system. The alerting system must differentiate between non-normal operations and emergency situations, right? So it gives the outcomes rather than assuming that the design is light switches and buttons, right? Now, the reason this is relevant to us is that when we're looking through these previously established types to see how much relief we can claim, it's more difficult to look at a function versus a system, especially where you've got configuration changes, and understand the degree to which the integrity of that function may have been compromised by whatever the gap is that we have. Right, so I hope that makes sense to everybody, because it's an important point. Okay, so we've had a look at some previously existing types. We've gone through and done some analysis to work out how much we can use them. Now, what are our outcomes and what do we do with some of the gaps? Right, the MCRE, a military certification review item. So there's 5 different types there. I'll let you read through them real quick. All right, so again, this is one of the introductions as part of the DASA that didn't formally exist under TA regs, but once you look at them, we really did all these things under TA regs. We just didn't necessarily do them in an equivalently robust way. All right, now the old airworthiness issue paper to look at a gap, say we're going to do nothing about it because we don't have the ability to, or because it's too hard, or because whatever insert reason, right? That still exists. Right, so, and that airworthiness issue paper is covered by an exception MCRE. Right, now, yeah, so I've said there on that first line, the AWIP includes a 7-step WHS process. Now, right back up towards the beginning of the presentation, we talked about the link between the DASA and the WHS. The DASA is the ADF means of compliance with that WHS Act. So by the time we get through to this point, we're saying we don't have evidence to show that we comply with this thing that we know we should comply with. what do we do about it? It goes direct back to WHS compliance, right? Because we haven't been able to treat the risk through the DASR and to establish best practice through the DASR. So a direct WHS assessment through that 7-step process to contextualize the risk, to understand it really well, and process through for retention. And that AWIP is then recorded with that exception MCRE in the CCL, and it stays there forever. Okay, so I would expect the exception MCREs are by far the most common MCRE that you'll come across, but yeah, there are a number of other things there which gives you some flexibility to do something about your gaps when you discover them as you're going through your program. Okay, so how do we bookend? We bookend the program by declaring compliance, and the type holder then holds that type. The type holder and the applicant aren't necessarily the same person. And as I've mentioned earlier, just because we declare compliance, it doesn't automatically follow that that modification is now part of that type. The type holder gets to make that decision. Okay, so with that in mind, I'll give you 30 seconds on this slide. All right, so fairly simple. Everything here we've talked about before. This is the declaration of compliance is the end of the certification process. From then on, it's up to the type holder to include it in their type, to include the MCREs and AWIPs and CCL, to modify the CCL that they had already established, if this is a modification, or to record all that data to say, this is my type that I will be managing and consciously evolving over the life type of the aircraft. Okay, so things go wrong in this process. Right, all the best laid plans in the world aren't going to cover all of the issues that we will find as we go through the execution of our program. So when something goes wrong, we've got to have options. So if the problem is small enough, if you have said you're going to meet something in a particular way, and you've kind of done it in another way, but it's a really low risk thing, really well known, maybe you're prepared to take the risk and just submit that with your declaration of compliance and say, hey, I haven't done it exactly as I planned, but it's pretty close. Here's what I have done. Please accept it. Right? And I've certainly done that before with no problems, but for pretty small things. All right. If it's not that small, there's also other options available to you there. You can turn around and generate more evidence. You can obviously resubmit your CPP if enough has changed. All right, so your your Air Warfare Centre contact, your DIA desk officer for your project or your platform can also help you with advice there if you think it's warranted. Right, there's a lot of professional judgment comes into this at this point, and we're about negotiating position, negotiating something that's suitable. So when it goes really wrong, again, I'll give you 30 seconds. Now, I'm sure these outcomes are reasonably well known by all. However, so some of these conditions are created or made worse under the DASR than they were under the T-regs. So because we have this MCRE concept, because the CCL is a living document, what you establish up front is what you have to live with and deliberately modify, consciously modify, right? Which wasn't necessarily the case in the past. So it's really important to get that as good as you can up front, because it will have potentially a big impact on the holder trying to upgrade and upkeep that type throughout the life of type of the platform. So the more you can do to make that initial type that's established easy to live with, easy to maintain, easy to upgrade, you know, the better service you're doing for partners and colleagues who will be managing that thing and be living with the consequences of your decisions in 20 or 30 years' time. So. All right, so we've come to the end. So we often think of this as a reasonably simple thing to do, and it can be straightforward depending on what you're buying, how you're buying it, who's doing this with you, which other militaries are involved. Right? It can be straightforward. It's usually not simple, and you know it can very easily get very complicated in ways that you may not have foreseen up front. Right. So the fundamentals of this process of executing a certification program, you know, the concepts haven't changed from TA Reg days. You establish your benchmark, you produce some evidence or rely on someone else's evidence. You get to the end and declare that you're done, right? Evidence is produced in the same kind of way. Evidence is recognized in the same kind of way. The airworthiness codes are almost all the same, Right? However, some of the key ways in which that program is executed have changed. Right? So if you've done these things before under the TA regs, that's great. It's an excellent experience to have, to understand how the DASR works and how you could successfully execute a program under the DASR. But there are some of those key changes that you would want to get your head around to make sure you give yourself the best chance of success and not having some rather large schedule surprises down the track. Right. Now, and I've said here, everyone's still learning, and that includes the regulator. So there are questions, even on, say, recent programs that I've been involved in, where we've gone back and asked about the extent to which some of these regulations are applied, and asked about interpretation on particular things. And some of those questions are still questions that the regulator hadn't had at that point in time and didn't have a good answer for. Right, so because it's still fairly new, everybody involved is still learning. So this is the time when smart engineers and robust thinkers, people who are willing to get involved with partners who have a good network of people who know what they're doing, who have good access to the regulator and the test agency. Those people are key to the success of your program. Right, no matter who they are, no matter where they come from, they're key to the success of this program because it's still such early days. So I hope this presentation has been useful for you tonight. I hope everybody's got something out of it. I can see something in the chat. Yeah, nothing. So are there any questions? Anything anybody wants to raise at this point?
Yeah, good day, Mark. Dave Zemmel, how are you?
Hi, Dave.
Yeah, just a quick question. You mentioned early on in your slide pack that there was some consideration in bringing the functional and performance specifications into the certification process. Just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on what the thought behind all that is, or how it might look like.
Right. So it's less about bringing the FPS into the certification framework, but more about Air Warfare Centre attempting to create a similar situation with the FPS being a living document, with the temp being a living document, so that those similar to the CCL being a deliberately evolved document over the lifetime of the aircraft, that the FPS would be the same, that the temp would live on and ensure that through modifications to the mission system, the functionality that they had in the original aircraft wasn't degraded accidentally. Right. So there's been a lot of modifications over time that have changed aircraft in ways that we hadn't really realised, particularly in certain roles that we don't really do that often. Right? It's only when you go and do training for those roles and you work out something's changed, it doesn't quite work the same. And there's some emergency CT amongst the green suiters to work out how to get something done by doing it differently. Right. So I don't know how far through that they are, but there are T&E guys who have been moved into key positions, and certainly the Air Force headquarters T&E footprint has grown in the last couple of years because they want to set up that kind of arrangement.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I'll wait with interest to see how that plays out, given that functional performance specifications are as much about the overall capability as they are about an individual mission system. So it'll be interesting to see how they can make the FPS relevant once you go beyond source selection and the certification process. So we'll wait out and see. But thanks for your presentation. Good stuff.
Yep. Thanks for tuning in. Anybody else? All right. Thanks everybody for coming along tonight. I'll hand back over to Dave Holder.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I hope that's been useful for everyone who's attended today. Give you some insight into the process and some of the issues regarding Airworthiness certification. As always, we're open to feedback and suggestions. So if there's anything you'd like to know a little bit more about from today's presentation, or there's something you'd like to see in the future, please let us know. The next session of the Learning Together program will be on US export controls, and that will be presented by one of the AeroPM team, Glenn Wade Farrell, on the 10th of August. Information on that will be broadcast using LinkedIn, and if you have any more questions you have about what AeroPM does or any of the other kind of capabilities we have within the team, please reach out to us or have a look on our website as well. So in the meantime, thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate that you've given up your time to join us, and we hope to see you for our future sessions as part of the Learning Together program. And we wish you a wonderful evening. Okay, thank you very much and good night.